Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Mark Skidmore. I'm the director of the North Central Regional Center for Rural Development, and welcome to today's webinar. We have Professors Hyung Kim and Gregory Newmark from Kansas State University, and the topic of their webinar is Redefining Rural Food Deserts by Transportation Networks. Dr. Kim's research interest is in understanding the relationship between the built environment and human behavior, especially in community design and human health and well-being. Dr. Newmark's research is focusing on understanding the relationship between transportation policy and travel behavior. So the two of them working together on the topic of rural food deserts, I think, makes a lot of sense. So thank you, Dr. Kim and Dr. Newmark, for doing the webinar today. And before I turn it over to you, I just want to remind the audience that if you do have some questions, you can use the chat session down below and put it in there, and then Drs. Kim and Newmark can catch those questions as they come or at the end. Okay, so with that introduction, I'd just like for the two speakers to go ahead and take over. Thanks again.
Thank you, Mark. Sorry, it took me a while to unmute. Well, I just want to start by saying we are very appreciative to the NCRCRD for supporting this project. This is actually my first research project as an assistant professor, anyways, it's really wonderful to be supported to do work that you feel is very important and interesting. So, so our project, as it says, is Redefining Rural Food Deserts by Transportation Networks. And I would like to introduce my co-author. Jen, you want to say hi?
Hi.
So we'll tag team somewhat through the presentation, but just to give some context, and I assume that I'm kind of preaching to the choir here, but Manhattan, Kansas, where K-State is located, is a city of about 50,000 people, including the students, but it's surrounded by communities that are rural and that are in decline. And so one of the issues of real concern for both of us is the sustainability of these communities, and one element is, of course, food access. So food access, is particularly important for all rural residents, but particularly for those that come from social groups or in social situations that are less able to travel. So older adults, disabled, low-income populations. So with that in mind, we think that the current policy aimed at improving food access in rural areas may not be sufficiently sensitive to the actual travel behaviors and needs of rural residents, and we're concerned that current policymaking focuses on a very simple kind of distance-based view of the food desert that is imported from urban environments, and urban environments are just sufficiently different that we're not convinced that model, which is very appropriate in urban areas, really ports properly into rural areas. So to demonstrate, this is the definition that the USDA ERS provides, which is they define low access, which is one of their standards for a food desert, as greater than 1 mile from the nearest supermarket, supercenter, or large grocery store for an urban area, or greater than 10 miles for a rural area. And the image of a food desert is so powerful. The idea of real privation for one of life's necessities, and kind of being out there exposed, trudging through the desert to try to get some groceries. But there's a difference in walking 1 mile, which is assumed to be about 20 minutes at a reasonable pace, versus 10 miles. So which would be like a 3-hour walk. So it already assumes that you have access to a motor vehicle, and that kind of changes, we think, the meaning of a food desert, and we want to explore that and understand it better so that we could have just better insight into the kind of interventions that will help rural areas be food secure and help rural populations be more sustainable. So we basically feel that the definition of a food desert really affects how we understand the problem of nutrition and how we address it. And we're concerned that multiple coexisting definitions can result in, say, in a single area qualifying and not qualifying, for certain programs, say. And for example, in the ERS definition that I cited is actually one of 4 different definitions, and these where you would qualify under one and not under others. So, but even more broadly, it's very difficult to compare research on food deserts because so many different criteria are being used. And we're also nervous that if the criteria are too loose, that the concept will lose its real meaning with the public, which could be a shame. I think that the meaning and the idea of a food desert is so powerful and resonant. We just need to make it, really, truly meaningful. So we have several research tasks to approach this or these issues, and I have them numbered, but they really were largely in parallel. But I'll go through them kind of in order. So the first thing was we really wanted to kind of get back to the roots and identify what does the literature on food deserts say about how those food deserts are defined. So we wanted to really cut to the core and extract the key elements of food desert definitions and identify the trade-offs with different definitions to approach a more consistent way of thinking about things, or at least kind of understand what the environment is to say, these seem to work better than these, and in general. But this is a particular concern for rural food deserts because the unique context of rural communities, which is just distinct from the kind of urban food deserts that most people are writing about. So we saw kind of 2 key elements of a definition. This is of food deserts. One is you need to have the presence of some qualifying food resource, some oasis in the desert, so to speak. And you also need to consider the ease of access to that resource. And so I should say that I showed this slide. We presented this to a planning conference in Salina, Kansas, and this sign is not from Salina, Kansas, but it was relevant for the idea that the access to services of any sort were so difficult that anyways, it demonstrates the access point of view. We are not focusing on the income issue, which is an important consideration for many, many people when they think about food deserts. Really focus on income. Given the really high rates of car access in rural areas, we're stepping aside from the question of income, really just focusing on the presence of a food resource and the ease of access to that resource. So we noticed that, and this is summarizing lots of literature, of course, but there are kind of 2 main approaches to identifying what is an acceptable food resource. One is a direct measure of that resource. So, for example, is food available? Like, are there fruits and vegetables at a specific venue? There was also, we noticed, many kind of secondary levels of appropriateness of that food. So, is it affordable? Is it culturally matching the community that needs access to it? Those kinds of things. We also noticed there were a set of proxy measures that are not really measurements of food, but are proxies for the underlying benefits of the food resource. So, for example, the USDA uses, as I read earlier, a store category measure. So, as a proxy measure, like, is it a supermarket? Or you might use the gross floor area, that in a store needs to be of a certain size. And certainly you could have a small store that has lots of food, but this is a simple way to kind of by proxy kind of get to what that resource really is. So I'm going to speed up slightly. Most definitions allow a single resource to qualify. If there's just one store, you're no longer living in a food desert. Some require that there be multiple options, and I really like this ABC criteria that we've seen, which is there needs to be availability, there needs to be backup, and there needs to be some choice. And now moving from the food resource to the access definition, most commonly people use simple travel distances and typically a straight line distance that is indifferent to the road network. So they would buffer the food resource and without concern for the actual road network. And that also reflects kind of early GIS. Now that we have much stronger GIS capabilities, we're looking at network distances. So, what is the actual distance that a person has to traverse to get there? And I particularly like Washington State's definition, so I'm showing them here. So Washington State has a 1 mile walking distance, not a straight line distance. And they also focus on, as an alternative, travel time. So there's a 20-minute driving threshold. And since we assume that people walk at 3 miles per hour, 1 mile walking distance is the same as a 20-minute driving threshold. So now there is an approach that's been used that tries to combine both the resource definition and the access definition, and this is actually quite common for rural areas. So it's to identify the number of qualifying stores in a given geography, typically a county, and so it's often used for rural areas. But this is problematic because it doesn't consider the distribution of the stores in relationship to the residents, and often all the stores are clustered in one area. And it also doesn't consider edge effects. So, there may be no store at all in your county, but you live, just next door to an area with lots of resources. So this density approach would not capture that well. So anyway, so this was just kind of our initial exploration of different types of definitions to give us ideas on how to redefine food deserts. And the kind of takeaways from this were that it is important to include perhaps a broader mix of stores, not just supermarkets, but also, particularly in a rural context, local grocery stores, farmers markets, community-supported agriculture, and other types of food outlets that that people use. And we also feel that it's important to consider the access definition should reflect the actual network distance or travel time. And this is particularly important as limited road networks can really increase distances in rural areas. And in places like Kansas and Michigan that that are part of the kind of the Jeffersonian grid system, that it's not too bad. But if you're in places like Vermont or Colorado, where you have lots of mountains and the roads are particularly circuitous, then the road distances become very significant. All right, so our next task was try and understand how rural and urban grocery travel vary by actually looking at the data. So we used the National Household Travel Survey. We used the data from the 2009 sample, and we focused only on the U.S. Census Bureau's Midwest region, which perfectly coincides with the NCRCRD boundaries. And in that sample, there were about 13,000 households, about a third of which were rural, which is actually a higher proportion than the survey as a whole, which is great for for our study. And we found some things that are quite interesting. Surprising to us, the probability that a household would shop on any given day was pretty similar between urban and rural areas. And I mean, it was statistically more for urban areas, but it wasn't, meaningfully more. And similarly, the average duration of any given shopping activity was, roughly the same between urban and rural households. But things were really different when you got to the miles from home for shopping. So we looked at people who made trips that went from their house to a shopping venue, and on average, in rural areas in the Midwest, that trip was 10 miles, which was twice as long as the almost 5-mile trip that someone in an urban area would make. But interestingly, the travel time was not that different. The rural resident did travel farther, or rather travel longer, so 18 minutes versus 15 minutes. Oh, and let me bring up the arrow so I can be clear what I'm showing you. Sorry. So here are the travel distances, but the travel times the differences are not as significant because people in rural areas are able to drive more quickly. And in fact, when you look at people that went shopping not starting from home and not from another shopping venue, then while the distances are still longer for the rural residents, the actual travel times were shorter, which was a surprising and interesting finding. Now, this is, as one might expect, the rural residents almost exclusively went by private transportation. So they went by car or truck, or a charter bus, or a motorcycle, or other, which could be like tractor and other type vehicles. And very rarely did they bike or walk, and there were no case, and virtually 0% of the population, the rural population, shopped via public transit. By contrast, the walk share for urban residents was 7.3% for shopping trips, which is pretty high, given how little Americans walk, and the transit share was also relatively high, 2.1%. And the bike share also not bad, showing that the mode choice between rural residents who go shopping and urban residents is pretty different, and therefore our concern, say, for a walkable distance is maybe not as significant. Now, there is one data point that I'm not showing here, which is rural residents are much less likely to start their shopping trip from a home location. And we'll talk about why that is a little bit later on, but it's an important point that I wanted to note. So the takeaways here are that rural residents travel farther and spend more time traveling to grocery outlets, but the time increase is not proportional to the distance increase. And as I noted just a second ago, rural shopping is almost entirely made by private vehicle. All right, so the problem with the National Household Travel Survey, which is a wonderful data source, and the new data set just came out, is that it's a one-day survey, and shopping is a behavior that most people don't engage in every single day, or most households don't engage in every single day. So we wanted to get a broader sense of how people actually shop, and also the decision-making process that goes with that. And so we conducted a series of focus groups in Kansas and North Dakota, and we chose those states because Kansas is our backyard. And through our extension program, we had very strong connections with North Dakota, and we felt that that would provide a kind of the southernmost part of the region and the northernmost part of the region. We'd cover our bases that way. So we did kind of two different approaches to focus groups. Here in Kansas, we conducted all of the focus groups in Emporia, Kansas, and had people from rural areas come in. And in North Dakota, we went out to small towns for the focus groups. And so here's just some data about the Kansas focus group. And as you can see, so Emporia is located here. Manhattan, where K-State is up here. It's about an hour-and-a-half distance. And the people in our focus group came from the surrounding towns. And this shows you roughly the populations of those towns and the distances from those towns to Emporia. And in North Dakota, the towns were generally smaller and at a much greater distance from Bismarck. That gives just a little sense of the communities. Now, we could not, in our IRB, we couldn't take pictures, so this is a generic image just to represent a focus group. So the slide would be, not just words, but we basically wanted to know. We asked them about their grocery shopping patterns and behaviors, and as a kind of prompt, while we were, kind of everyone was coming in, we had them fill out a short travel diary to spark their thinking about their last grocery shopping trip. And we also talked to them about their challenges and barriers to food access, and asked about potential improvements, although surprisingly it tended more to focus on the challenges than possible solutions. So hang on just one moment. So the concerns were, not surprisingly, the low access to grocery stores, that many people didn't live in a town with a grocery store or any kind of convenience mart. And even those that did still felt the need to travel to either have cheaper prices or more variety. So some quotes include the exotic stuff that no one else wants and weird things, but the examples that they give were not that exotic. It was like sugar-free products or chicken breasts or artichokes. So it's kind of interesting. And there was also concern about food quality in local venues, mostly about produce, but also just about selection in general. And another issue that really came out was that the distance made weather a significant risk to food access in a way that we hadn't really anticipated. So people would talk about how in the summer they wouldn't buy ice cream, or they would be concerned about buying even chicken because that on the trip home that it would just get too hot in the car and might go bad. And conversely, in the winter, particularly in North Dakota, the storms might make roads impassable, and therefore, increase the potential stress regarding food access, for people in those communities. So we really focused on adaptations and the kind of behaviors that people use to adjust to this in order to inform our own thinking. And a very common one was that households would patronize multiple grocery stores. A small selection, mostly older people, expressed contentment with the local offerings, and they would rather spend more than travel farther. But most people that expressed where they shopped in the focus groups shopped in at least 3 different stores, often for different purposes. But they did all value having a local option for kind of sundry items, and also as a backstop in case they forgot something. Now, here's just a list of the stores that were spoken about the most. I'm mostly showing this slide to show that even these smaller local places, like this meat market in Emporia or this small grocery store in North Dakota, were very important. And our definitions of food access really needs to consider these kind of venues as serious venues for providing food access. Another adaptation, which as a transportation planner, I was intrigued by, was the trip training. So it seemed like virtually nobody went to a store and came back. That in fact they always linked their shopping trips to other activity purposes. So during the weekend, shopping might be their main purpose, and they would often go, and around their shopping trip they would have like an outing where they would go. People reported like they take their family, they go to a restaurant, or they go do something, and then they would do a big shopping, and then they would come home. On weekday trips tended to focus on smaller shopping, faster shopping, but a very common refrain was that I never went to town without doing a little bit of shopping. And just to kind of illustrate this, weekday shopping, people talked about shopping at their lunch hour and putting stuff in the refrigerator at their workplace. A lot of shopping also, around school pickup times, and in the evenings, where weekend shopping was coupled with other shopping or different kinds of recreational activities and also medical activities. Another adaptation is bulk purchasing. Here's a quote from a woman who basically didn't shop locally because she ate mostly chicken breasts, and as she said, she can get a great big pack at Target, and it's just easier for her to go there and buy food in bulk. That's one form of bulk purchasing. Another form is that because rural communities have access to agriculture, a lot of families talked about buying like a half or a quarter of a cow and using that for the entire winter. So that is interesting because it's a purchase that's not made at a grocery store. It's kind of unique to the rural environment, but it also represents a huge outlay of cash up front. So that's not something that everyone can do. Another option, again, that is more well suited for rural areas than urban ones, although thankfully increasingly in urban areas, is vegetable gardens. So half the participants had a vegetable garden, and people talked about how they would can or freeze their produce and often share that with their neighbors, and often talk about how it was very helpful in reducing costs, but also for increasing the resilience. So if they couldn't make it to a store for a few days, they had produce that they could live off of, and conversely, they didn't have to buy spaghetti sauce all winter because they had pre-made it. Now, these adaptations, of course, require lots of space to store things and specialized appliances. So people talked about having large pantries, having multiple freezers in their basements, and by multiple, I mean like 3. And also another common adaptation was that people would keep a cooler in their vehicle so that if they were out, they could buy frozen or refrigerated food and have a chance at getting it home in the summer, say, without worrying about it. And people also mentioned how the size of the cooler often limited their what they could purchase. So the takeaway from this task was that rural residents really feel the challenge of low food access, and they adapt through a bunch of different strategies. And these strategies can differ by life stage, where seeing how older adults could shop, say, differently than younger families, and also activity locations. So people that worked in a town would often shop near their workplace. And we also noticed that many of the resilience strategies, which mostly tied to pantry stocking, would just not be reasonable in an urban environment where people would not have the space to have multiple freezers and store very large amounts of meat. All right, so our last task was that I'm presenting was to kind of bring these together and look at a network analysis of rural food access. And it may be a little tough to see, but the slide on the left shows the simple buffers of food access with if you buffered food stores with just a circular 10-mile buffer. And the slide on the right does an overlay of, well, what if you considered the road network? And you can see in almost every case that the purple buffers are smaller, and they allow the blue buffers to show through, meaning that the actual experience for people in these communities is not that they can get to food in 10 minutes, but the areas, say, that are not food deserts by the standard definition is smaller than we kind of think they actually are. Now, we were able to get special access. We requested special access to add-on portions of the National Household Travel Survey. And these are cases where states, and in some cases metropolitan planning organizations, had paid the federal government to take extra samples for their own purposes. And while you can't get access to the federal data, you can get access to when there have been add-ons. So we made individual requests to different states, got those data, and this is showing the data from Wisconsin. And we basically took the household locations of everyone in rural areas that were surveyed as part of the NHTS in Wisconsin, and then we got all the locations of kind of major shopping, grocery shopping venues, and we used the road network to analyze what are the distances to the closest shopping venue. And you can see this is the let me bring out my arrow is not the arrow that you can see. So here's the distribution of distances, and the median distance, so half the people are on this side, half the people are on this side, is about just under 10 miles for rural communities, and in fact, 3/4 of the population is under 18 miles. So this made us think that perhaps the measure of food security being 10 miles is too short. 20 would make more sense, and maybe even these other options further out make sense. Now, what we are continuing to do, and we've had some struggles with using the network analysis in rural areas because we're concerned that some rural roads are not being picked up, and therefore we're maybe getting slightly longer distances than we would anticipate. But we're continuing to work with the add-on data to see where people actually shopped and what the distances of not just the closest venue, but the venue that they chose, to get a better sense of where people are choosing to shop. So that is kind of where we are, and so I wanted to just wrap up with our takeaway from this last task, that the straight line buffers are not a good measure of the food access experience, and it also seems like the 10-mile distance is more of the norm than an outlier, and so we might want to reconsider what an appropriate distance is. So with that, I look forward to everyone's questions. Here is Professor Kim and my contact information, and we're continuing to develop this research. We again really appreciate the opportunity to start exploring it, and we're looking forward to kind of developing more journal articles and kind of proposals, based on what we've learned. So thank you very much.
Okay, thanks, Greg and Hyung. We do have a few minutes for interaction and questions, so if you do have a question, you can place it in the chat here. One question I have, and maybe I'll start us going, was it looks like Amazon is planning to, or potentially increasingly going to offer delivery of food. And I'm just wondering if any of that discussion came up as part of the work that you're doing, having food delivered.
Absolutely. Actually, so just for brevity, I didn't include that in the presentation, but we thought that online shopping might be a major solution for communities. But what we found out, at least in North Dakota, where this came up, was that because Amazon outsources with the USPS, with the U.S. Postal Service, for delivery, people would have to go to the post office, which was actually often quite at some distance from their house. And so for those people, it obviated the benefit of online groceries, which was not something that we had anticipated. And of course, it's possible that Amazon, particularly with their purchase of Whole Foods, will change their model. But currently, it's for groceries, it's been undermined by their delivery method.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks. I don't see that anybody's adding a question here. We have just put up the summary evaluation. We really appreciate your feedback. So for the participants, please go ahead and fill that out. We'll wait for just a moment in case somebody wants to type in a question for both of you. I think your comment about, or your just the whole discussion about, well, how far is it really for you to get food, and what are some of the barriers? It looks like, if you were to summarize, would you say that maybe food access isn't, for many people in rural areas, isn't too bad?
Well, I would say that it's, I think it's just a different kind of ball of wax than in urban areas, and that the option for almost everyone has a car, and almost everyone has land, and so and has some kind of like agricultural connections. So the impacts, are it's not really, I wouldn't say it's a desert. It's a different, yeah. So I think it's not as bad as we thought, but I still think that ensuring good nutrition in rural areas is very important. But this simple idea of a food desert, I think, doesn't quite apply, and I think we need to make it more nuanced so we can come with better solutions, to help the people that do need access. If say through produce bus or other things, and we haven't so much focused on that, but more just understanding the behaviors.
Right. I see we have a couple of people typing in questions. I live in the East Lansing area in a community called Bath, which is kind of rural, and we have a Walmart bus that comes through every once in a while, which I thought was interesting.
So, all right. So we see from Patricia Barron a question about what about ride sharing for those rural areas? We asked the question slightly differently, or I wouldn't say asked, but we kind of broached this a little bit differently, which is do people share food purchasing? Like, oh, hey, I'm going to town, can I pick you up something? And there was less of that than we thought. It was mostly just family networks. Oh, my daughter's coming in and she's bringing some food, but we didn't have any. I don't know, did we have any comments?
We don't have any ride sharing information.
Yeah, I mean, I think one person talked about how she drove an elderly neighbor in with her, but the culture of self-sufficiency was very strong and very interesting. I didn't grow up in a rural area, so it's new to me. So, okay, so I see another question is about research in rural Arizona. We did notice some households that do not have access to private vehicles. This is definitely true. I'm not saying that everyone in rural areas has a car, but that for food access, people use cars. So this is a case where actually ride sharing, does sometimes come into play. For example, we did work in eastern Kansas, but we've separately proposed a proposal for understanding behaviors in western Kansas, where there's a really strong immigrant community, and understanding how not all of whom say have access to driver's license and other things. What's going on to get people access. And yes, if you do not have private vehicles, then you have limited access. But again, there's all these other techniques that people are managing. Okay, so Nathan Crook, who lives in Southern Ohio, and I'm from Cincinnati, so I'm very pro Southern Ohio. Some residents of Southern Ohio can cross the lines to buy groceries. If you look to the economic base in some of these rural areas to learn if they can support greater access to food. I think what you're suggesting is there enough kind of local money that it would make sense to put in a grocery store? I'm not sure. Nathan, could you confirm if that's what you're talking about? Yes. Okay. Not so much. Our research has been really focused on understanding the food travel behaviors. I would be speaking beyond what we've studied to respond to that. Leon asked about the ethnic cultural backgrounds people that participate in your studies. I think that so we reached out through extension, and I think that in North Dakota it was pretty white, and in Kansas it was also pretty white, but there was some Latino.
Yeah, Latinos.
So it was white and Latino, and it was very disproportionately women who participated in the focus groups. To be fair, shopping is highly gendered, and so often the brunt of food purchasing, did fall on women. But interestingly, they would also talk about the roles that their husbands or partners played in sharing some of the food access issues. So Zhaokin Tong talks about how, given the long distance to town, this imposes a lot of constraints on single parents. They will have to use less healthy stores, but close. That could be, but again, we're really trying to emphasize the idea that there's lots of adaptations that are not just tied to the distance from your home to the food store, that many people in rural areas already work at quite some distance from their homes, or their kids go to school at quite some distance from their homes, and that those locations often have food sources, and so people shop there. So it's not necessarily true that a long distance means necessarily less access. You might be driving there anyway.
Adding to that, some parents, single parents, they use the grocery store nearby their child's school or daycare. So in terms of train, trips.
And while people are typing, I do want to add that there has been a loss of rural grocery stores. Oh, hang on, our computer just. And one service that we asked about is, kind of local stores can do things like provide credit and other kind of financial elements for lower income people, and that as those stores disappear, not only do they lose the food access, but they lose the credit access. Okay, so Patrick in Waushara, different times, season of the year, is number of trips or access. We found that there was a fair amount of seasonality to food access. That people talked about the different seasons when different, say, animals would be kind of plumped up, and they were kind of thinking about when they would get turkeys and pigs and cows. Also, we mentioned a lot of trips were tied to school times, and then in the winter, particularly in North Dakota, there were clearly times that people had suffered, like they couldn't get out of their communities for like 2 weeks. So, so there was, a lot of talk of stockpiling and how grateful they were for local grocery stores when stuff like that happened, and they could, still, access some food. I mean, also we should say that we did our focus groups in the summer just because when we had the time to, and so that may have slightly skewed, more discussions. But this is also just our first year of research, so we're hoping to learn a lot more. And now that there's a new National Household Travel Survey, we'll see if things have changed. So we're building on this.
Well, perhaps this is a good time to wrap up. I see Patricia has one more question, and maybe we'll take that, and Liana is typing, and then we can finish up the session.
Sure. Well, Mark, again, thank you very much. And to everyone who is responding, please feel free to email us. We're really learning, and this is a new area for kind of both of us. And we really value the feedback and the insights of people that are already working, in this space. In terms of Patricia's question about food pantries, I don't think they really came up. Most people kind of maintain their own. And Liana, so Adowkin, we look forward to hearing from you. It sounds like you have a lot of really good experience in Arizona. Oh, okay. Thank you, Liana. We look forward to that as well. So, like I said, this was very much trying to explore a lot of different qualitative and quantitative resources to get a handle on the complexity of rural food travel, so that we could come up with better ways to think about food deserts and to frame food policy in rural areas. And it's very much in progress. And again, anyways, thank you all, and thank you, Mark and Rosa, for setting this all up.
Thank you very much.
Well, thank you, and thanks again for all this great work and doing the webinar. All right, everyone, we'll close up for now. Thanks again.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.